It's interesting to see the rise and fall of video game franchises, such as the regular releases and consistency of mainstream titles such as Call of Duty and Mario, or the long-shelved but not quite retired intellectual properties of old classics like F-Zero and Splinter Cell. One series with a tempestuous past but a definite history of glory and success would be Konami's Castlevania series. Many review outlets, and even Nintendo themselves, recognize the first entry of the franchise as one of the best games on the Nintendo Entertainment System and Famicom, if not one of Nintendo's greatest all-time classics. Castlevania was one of the first action platformer games released on the NES, and notably one of the darker, more serious games in terms of design. Consider the fact that the existing NES library at the time was only 42 games, 29 of which, or over 2/3, were of Nintendo's original lineup consisting mostly of sports games and arcade ports, as well as titles like Clu Clu Land and Wrecking Crew. We didn't even have Metroid, Kid Icarus, or even The Legend of Zelda yet, at least in the West. So in the midst of everyone playing home versions of their favorite arcade titles like Donkey Kong and Gradius, along comes Castlevania, this gritty, action-packed adaptation of a classic horror story to bring a little more contrast to the Nintendo library, especially in a genre that was most notably occupied by smaller titles like Micronic's Ghosts and Goblins or Tose's Ninja Kid. So we'll figure out how our hero, Simon Belmont, stood out and made his mark as we uncover what's so great about Castlevania. With a game as new and fresh as Castlevania was at release, there were bound to be new mechanics we hadn't seen in that handful of already circulating Nintendo titles, right? Well, they better have a good way of teaching you those new features, and of course, Konami wastes no time in instructing their players how to brave Dracula's castle. The very first walkway uses these very standout torch sprites to draw the player's focus. As with many of these NES games, you quickly try out the functions of the two buttons at your disposal, which will cause you to whip at the torch, breaking it, and revealing a chain whip upgrade. As you pick it up, you can mark the visual difference in your attack, but otherwise you have no context for its purpose. Maybe it's more powerful? Next, however, you'll pick up another whip upgrade, this time definitely demonstrating a boost in terms of range for your weapon. But more importantly, you now know that pieces of the environment will break to reveal upgrades, weapons, and other goodies for you. The gray background of the castle entrance also allows for the recognizability of the candles on the walls, and if a player knocks those candles down, they'll generally be greeted by a small heart-shaped object floating to the ground. Upon being picked up by the player, this heart doesn't actually heal you, but goes into a completely separate meter off to the right, which counts up from 0, but we don't know why. Don't worry about that, because soon enough you may find yourself to be collecting other items that stand out in your heads-up display, maybe a clock, or an axe, or a vial of holy water. And even if you haven't taken a look at the manual for this game, you'll probably before long be doing what any player of an NES game would do with the limited controls at their disposal, which is to combine the few buttons that you have access to. In this case, the up button and the attack button, which lets you wield whatever bonus weapon you've collected most recently. Now let's back up for a moment. We mentioned those hearts that you've been collecting, and how they don't heal you, right? Well, once you figured out how to wield that fancy dagger you've picked up, you may notice that for every instance of using that secondary item or weapon, your collection of hearts begins to shrink. So now we have the purpose of that counter. And if you like that secondary weapon, and more importantly later on, once you know which weapons will give you an advantage against certain enemies, you may decide that it's in your best interest to keep collecting those hearts. As you continue to the right, going up and down a few staircases to get used to the movement of the game, at some instances, you may be greeted by enemies waiting for you at the bottom of the staircase. And if you happen to whip at them on a certain staircase in that first level, you may notice that a tile of the wall breaks away, exposing some meat. If you collect this new item in time, you'll see your health bar jump back up. And there you have it. Much like arcade titles, healing yourself is going to be a matter of luck and chance unless you know the right patterns to make it happen. However, also like some arcade titles, if you're willing to take the time, you can probably find ways to grind for more lives, as they're given out for reaching certain point thresholds. So there you have it. All of this is taught to you in the very first level of the game, if not the first few minutes. From there on out, other than learning what certain items do or memorizing specific attack patterns of new monsters you'll encounter, you have all the building blocks you need to storm the castle and take on the beasts inside. Once you reach the second level, everything immediately becomes a little harder. more difficult traversing of obstacles with newly added pits and even moving platforms, more difficult combat with Medusa heads that waver much more than the bats at the castle entrance, even spotting the candles on the walls is a little bit tougher, with no gray backgrounds to stand out against, but instead a constant surface of red bricks. This is where you very quickly have to take everything you learned in that first level and put it to use in a more stressful setting. After all, we can only assume that it won't get any easier from here on out. Now's the time to figure out how to smoothly navigate movement and combat together simultaneously, getting used to the arc of your jump, the length of your whip, and the patterns of the enemies. I'm surprised at how smooth the combat is despite the enemy's vast range of motion and Simon's very limited range of motion. Aside from the excitement of stumbling across a random piece of meat in the wall and getting back up to full health, the best sensation that this game provides has to be the point where you understand a new enemy's attack pattern well enough to completely avoid being damaged by them before sending them to their demise. The great consistency of enemies in this game lends itself to an excellent learning curve for the player in terms of efficiency, with a new enemy being the bane of your existence when they first appear, to just being a random nuisance, if being a bother at all, in later encounters when you face tougher and more complicated monsters that actually demand your attention as you learn how to best them as well. The bosses don't even feel like they're even on the same playing field sometimes, especially if you've died close to the end of the level and have to face your next challenge without much in your arsenal. In fact, sometimes it seems as if the items you're given from the environment decline in quality or usefulness against that area's boss. So, if you can manage to get the earlier weapons and hang on to them throughout the level, you'll stand a much better chance than using whatever they give you closer to the end, if you get a weapon at all. But nothing is going to get any easier unless you learn how to protect yourself and make the best of your situation. Players that were searching for a challenge during the early days of the home video game world finally found what they were looking for in Castlevania. This game gets hard, even by today's standards. I think this is the best example I've ever played in terms of representing the old adage of Nintendo hard. And I don't mean the sort of heavily lopsided gameplay we see in an old title like Super Ghouls and Ghosts either, because here's where I think the difference is made. Castlevania is incredibly fair, it's just incredibly difficult too, at least in some of the later stages, and what really drives the point home is that it sparks that self-destructive fuse of making the player angry to the point that they start to play worse out of wanting to hurry up and beat this section. But it does an excellent job of drawing the player in as you want to prove to the game that you know how to beat it. It's just a matter of getting better at the game and finally nailing that difficult section to an immense sense of satisfaction. When I say this game is hard, I mean it stays hard. There isn't an exact point where it all clicks together in your head and you finally sink into the hand-eye coordination that you needed all along, and then you bob and weave your way through every stage. As you get better, the game acclimates to your skill by presenting more challenging obstacles, right up to the very end. Just as you get a hold of something, Castlevania sends a bigger, badder problem your way. But on the other hand, you don't have to worry about getting lucky to get through those tough sections. I would say that there isn't much luck in this game at all. Every monster, object, and item fall into pretty distinct patterns, to the point that a seasoned player of the game may very well have a strategy to get through the whole castle, down to a pattern of breaking certain candles over others, and which items they'll pick up on which boards. You can use these patterns to your advantage, and you may very well have to, in order to get the most out of these worsening conditions until you're finally able to see yourself get a little further in the level or do a little more damage to that boss. You're becoming better and better as a player, and when it's all said and done, you'll be a much better adventurer than you were at the foot of this fortress. Castlevania as a franchise is an interesting creature. It has ebbed and flowed in popularity and success over the years. Simon Belmont landed pretty solidly on the Famicom Disk System and Nintendo Entertainment System as a third-party creation that was designed to fill a much-needed void for players and audiences desiring something dark, something challenging, and something different from the sports and puzzle games that filled store shelves at the time. The series of Castlevania definitely held on to that success for years to come, with many more beloved entries, and though it faltered a few times, as any long-running series tends to do, it even saw its most successful entry in 2010 with Castlevania Lords of Shadow, 23 years after the original Castlevania entry. Not many franchises can boast to a legacy of that degree. Unfortunately, The video game series has fallen to the wayside along with Konami's other intellectual properties as the company shifted away from video games and focused on using their franchises for branding on pachinko machines. Hopefully, the series has not been laid to rest, however. The inclusion of Simon and Richter Belmont in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate to much fan excitement, and the success of a Netflix-produced anime following the franchise's plot, both demonstrate the lasting power of this old franchise, one we hope eventually sees a triumphant return to the gaming world. And this success all started with this little adventure of whipping at skeletons and looking for chicken in the walls. The game defines its rules and expectations in only a brief and succinct instance, and then subjects the player to an ever-increasing demand of ability and gaming prowess. The dark atmosphere constructed with a cinematic eye allowed this title to stand out from the vast majority of existing video games at the time to provide the gaming community with an exciting, difficult, yet fair and well-paced adventure through an homage to some of history's most famous monsters in a way that inspired so many other video games for decades to come. That is what's so great about Castlevania. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we faced the horrors of Castlevania. Make sure to tell us what you think about Castlevania, or even suggest a game for another video. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Ori and the Blind Forest, on screen or in the description, and please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.